Thanks, Kay. When I first saw that video, it made me think very quickly of the study that we just have finished in our men's group on Wednesday mornings, The Men We Need by Brant Hansen. And Dave, I'm assuming that you maybe saw a little bit of overlap there between the video and the book. And I mention that in part because I have been struck so often about how 1 week's study on Wednesday morning has somehow overlapped with the message for the next Sunday, and this week is no exception. Last week, for instance, some of the key words that came out in the chapter that we looked at were words like freedom and loyalty and submission. And let's talk for a moment about freedom. We will get to submission in a moment. How many of us recognize this flag? Few of us. Okay, anyone remember what it's called? The Gadsden flag. It's the Gadsden flag named after Christopher Gadsden. It is one of the most popular symbols of the American Revolution. It's still popular with a lot of people. And its motto, "Don't tread on me," is not only popular among many Americans, but I would argue that in many ways it captures the basic spirit of our age. Don't tread on me. Now, interestingly, the rattlesnake that we have in the Gadsden flag was used more than 20 years earlier by Benjamin Franklin in a very different way. This was probably the first political cartoon ever published in North America. And Franklin used a dismembered rattlesnake to emphasize the need for unity among the American colonies, to stick together. In a sense, to forego the demands for extensive personal liberty in order to survive. You may recall that Franklin is the one who was quoted as saying, "If we don't hang together, we shall certainly all hang separately." And on this cartoon, there's that phrase, "join or die." Unity. Unity. We've hit before in our look at Ephesians about how important the issue of unity is for the Apostle Paul. It's important not only in Ephesians, it's important in other ones of his writings, and that's why in chapter 4, verse 3, we looked at this a few weeks ago, he says, "Make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace." But for that to happen, we need, frankly, to sometimes get over ourselves and our own desires and our own preoccupations with what we want. And in a sense, it's that notion that is front and center in the verse that I want to look at this morning. That is chapter 5, verse 21 of Ephesians says simply this: "Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ." Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Submit, you're not going to find that word on any flag that I know of. And yet it's what Paul commands us to do. Submit out of reverence for Christ. Now, let's be honest. Humans don't like to submit, do we? We much prefer the "don't tread on me." That's why Paul has to write much of what he does at times, including here in Ephesians chapter 5. Brant Hansen, who wrote the book we've been studying as men, says it is shocking just how much freedom God allows us. And when I read that, it took my mind back to something that Krister Stendahl, the Lutheran bishop, wrote many years ago, where he said that human freedom is the freedom to betray God. And we betray him very well, don't we? I was struck recently by the slogan of one of our political parties had adopted. Simply this: become ungovernable. Become ungovernable. Now, to be fair, I am not convinced that they are actually advocating for anarchy. But think about what those two words suggest and the impression that they could leave. There are a lot of folks who may not use them, but they embrace what they imply. And I'm not thinking here necessarily in terms of politics, so don't read that into it. Again, it's kind of the spirit of our age. There are a lot of people who want to do what they want to do. And they will do it. Oftentimes with disastrous results. And if the results aren't necessarily for them, the disastrous results are for someone else. Ephesians 5:21 flies in the face of that individualism, that that extreme autonomy. It also marks something of a transition. I mentioned we're heading into a section of Ephesians that deals with family relationships in particular. And starting in verse 42, Paul will address several household relationships. We'll start wading into them next week. But if we go back to most of chapters 4 and 5, the things leading up to verse 21, Paul has been writing in a very general way about how life following Jesus is fundamentally different from life without Jesus. Underlying the entire discussion there is a very clear understanding, though. And that is that deciding to follow Jesus doesn't automatically or easily translate into following Jesus. And that's why Paul, not only here in Ephesians, but so many other places, gives lots of instructions. He tells us things to do. He tells us things to not do. He tells us about ways to live, ways not to live, ways to speak and act, ways to not speak and act. And as I skimmed through, again, the instructions that he gives in chapters 4 and 5 of Ephesians, I was reminded that so many of them, probably most of them, have to do with how we relate to other people, even though it's maybe not stated that way. And as I thought about it further, I thought, maybe we don't go to the extreme of don't tread on me. But as I thought about all the things that he writes there, and as I reflected on even my own life, I realized that among the things that Paul addresses there and elsewhere are things that every one of us at one time or another, in one way or another, has or will have to come to grips with. Submission, even to Jesus, isn't easy, and it isn't automatic. It's an ongoing set of decisions. Oftentimes it is a struggle, even for the best of us. And that's why Paul so often reminds us, either directly or indirectly, of the ongoing battle between our old nature and our new nature. The sinful nature and the new life in Christ. The battle is there. It's real. We're gonna come back to that toward the very end of our look at Ephesians. But if the battle wasn't there, Paul wouldn't have to keep reminding us that it is there, is it? Would he? He wouldn't have to write much of what he did, including these words that we have in front of us today: submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. But he had to write them because, we don't always like to submit. But then we've never liked to submit. Thinking back to Brant Hansen and Krister Stendahl, it is shocking how much freedom God allows, because our freedom is freedom to betray God, which is precisely what our first parents did and is precisely what everybody since then has done. If we go back a little bit in Ephesians 5, verse 1, Paul says, "Be imitators of God, therefore, as dearly loved children, and live a life of love, just as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us." just as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us. One of the things I think about from time to time, maybe you do too, is why any reasonable person would reject Jesus. I mean, it is astounding. At least it is to me. But it probably was even more astounding in Jesus' own day. I mean, think about everything that people saw him do, heard him teach, everything that people experienced about Jesus. Why would anyone have walked away? And yet they did. In fact, John tells us that there was a point at which people were running away from him faster than they were coming to him. But that's the entire pattern of human history. It's the pattern of the Bible and the Old Testament. No matter how much God did even for his own people, they continually rejected him. No matter how lovingly he treated them, they still refused to submit to his expectations. God was incredibly loyal to his people. He is still incredibly loyal to his people, thankfully. Back to Adam and Eve, though, our first parents. You know, I guess I can excuse people like us, in a sense, who have never known the sinless perfection that Adam and Eve enjoyed. We, however, as the hymn says, prone to wander. But Adam and Eve, that's how we start out. We start out in life prone to wander. But Adam and Eve, of all people, they should have known better. They were absolutely perfect at the start. Absolutely perfect. What's more, they could have everything in the world. They could have anything in the world that they could possibly want, except one lousy piece of fruit. But they had to have that fruit. And so what did they do? They did the one thing, the only thing God told them not to do. And we're all still paying the price. I can just hear him now. Oh, we're not going to hurt anyone. It's just a piece of fruit. Yeah, guess again. They did the one thing, the only thing God told them not to do. And that willingness to not submit, that willingness to rebel is embedded in our genes. It's in our DNA. It gets passed on from generation to generation. That's why no one has to teach us how to misbehave. A friend of mine used to say, if you don't believe in original sin, you've never had children. Children might say the same thing. If you don't believe in original sin, you've never had parents, but that's a different issue. We'll actually come back to that in a couple of weeks. When we fail to follow Jesus the way Paul encourages us to, instructs us to, not only in Ephesians but elsewhere, even when we do something that seems small, that seems insignificant, seems like it's not going to hurt anyone, all we do is reinforce everything that's wrong in us and wrong in the world. Humans don't like to submit. We never have liked to submit, but it is essential that we do. For a number of reasons. I'm going to give just three. We'll come back to a couple more, I suspect, in the next few weeks. But let me just start here, kind of a general level. It's essential that we submit for an orderly society. Romans 13. Paul says that we are to submit to the governing authorities. In fact, he says that if we do not submit, if we rebel against the governing authorities, we're actually rebelling against God, and we will face judgment for it. That's a pretty strong statement. Now, I don't say that to scare us, just to put the point out there. Now, there is an exception, it would seem. Acts 5:29 makes it clear, I believe it is clear, that when there is a clear disconnect between what people are telling us to do and what God clearly tells us to do, then we go with God. But that's when there's a clear disconnect. It's also important to the dignity of others, and this is something that we will flesh out, I think, more clearly in the next few weeks. Some folks think that Paul's words here, submit to one another, is an argument against any kind of hierarchy, especially among Christians. Now, there is a sense in which it definitely levels the playing field, and we will see that, but we have to not push the statement too far. Throughout the Scripture, and even here in Ephesians, we see that God actually created hierarchy, but He's created it for our good, for an orderly society, an orderly family life, orderly fill in the blank. So why might Paul say submit to one another here? Again, I think we'll understand better in the next few weeks, but let me just put this out there. First, because everyone is created in God's image. And no matter what our roles are, whether in the family or work or in society or in church or anywhere else, no matter what our roles are, there is a fundamental equality among people and a dignity among people that we dare not lose sight of. Everyone has infinite value before God, and everyone can learn from anyone else. But I would say Philippians 2:4 goes a little bit further than that. Or maybe it should say it takes a little different angle on it. Philippians 2:4, Paul says, each of you should look not only to your own interests, but also to the interests of others. This is a statement that, frankly, oftentimes turns hierarchy on its ear, particularly when we misuse hierarchy. Each of you should look not only to your own interests, but also to the interests of others. No matter who we're dealing with, Paul commands us to consider their needs, not just our wants. In many ways, I would argue that, and I don't think I'm alone in this, I would argue that is, in a sense, kind of at the core of what Paul is getting at here with mutual submission or submitting to one another, putting the needs of others ahead of ourselves. Third, submission, ironically, brings real freedom. Let's go back for a moment to Adam and Eve. Satan enticed them, and they agreed to set their own rules and ignore God's instruction. They exercised freedom. And what happened? Rather than submitting to God, they submitted to Satan. And by doing that, they became slaves to sin, and they made the rest of us slaves to sin. The very thing that they thought was going to be liberating became a curse. And the consequences have been catastrophic. And it's because of that Jesus came. He came to set us free. Galatians 5:1 says, "It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery." A little bit later, verses 13 and 14, he says this, "You, my friends, were called to be free, but do not use your freedom to indulge the sinful nature. Rather, serve one another in love." There's that putting other people ahead of ourselves. The entire law, Paul goes on to say, is summed up in a single command: love your neighbor as yourself. True freedom, true liberty, the ability to be who God created us to be in the first place, comes only by following Jesus. But following Jesus has demands. Jesus himself said that if you love me, you will obey me. And we do not obey if we do not submit. Let me close on this note. Willing submission is inseparable from Christian discipleship. And maybe that's why Paul talks about it more than 20 times in his letters in one way or another. Now remember, Paul is the apostle of grace. He is the one who talks about freedom perhaps more than anyone else, and yet he also talks about submission, and he does it almost 24 times. And he relates it here in reverence to Christ. Jesus himself set the example for us. Remember, Jesus is Lord of heaven and earth. Firstborn over all creation, the one in whom everything holds together, Paul says. And yet Jesus' life was one of submission. He submitted to his parents. He submitted to Jewish leaders. He submitted to Pilate and Roman soldiers. He submitted to any number of people who were clearly not his equals, let alone his superiors, and he submitted to any number of people who, frankly, at times were simply out to destroy him. And since we are Jesus' servants, and no servant is greater than his or her master, what does that say about what our posture should be? Willing submission is inseparable from Christian disciple because we are called to be like Jesus. And only when we are willing to follow Jesus wholeheartedly will we enjoy the real freedom, the real harmony, the real well-being that God has created us to enjoy. I want to go back just one moment to Ephesians 4:3. Make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. Unity and peace. We talked a few weeks ago about the essential oneness of the church. And the fact that Paul is eager to avoid anything that threatens that. Probably for a different reason, well, certainly for a different reason, but I think in some ways Paul would resonate with Ben Franklin's line, if we do not hang together, we shall certainly all hang separately. Nothing good comes for us or anyone else when we insist on putting ourselves first. Nothing good comes in our homes or our workplaces or our schools or our community or the church. Nothing good comes when we insist on clinging to our own rights, when we insist on putting ourselves ahead of someone else, or getting our own way at the expense of someone else. Nothing good comes of that. Which is why, once again, Paul says, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ.